These are the most interesting historical photos and unusual objects from the past. Let's get 100,000 subscribers. In 1979, Tseng Hai-sun and He Ki-sun played their wedding, suspended by their hair under a helicopter in West Germany. The couple calmly exchanged golden rings in the air, turning their ceremony into one of the craziest love tricks. This white Chevrolet carried Dominican leader Rafael Trujillo when his long rule ended on a dark highway near Ciudad Trujillo in May 1961. The shattered glass and metal scars show how one night on the road suddenly closed a 31-year dictatorship. A logging train has jumped the narrow tracks and spilled giant tree trunks down a steep Pacific Northwest hillside. Temporary logging railroads like this were rebuilt again and again, and accidents like this were treated as just another cost of feeding the early timber boom. Thick white trails claw into the sky as a German Navalwerfer 41 battery fires a full salvo across the fields. Designed in World War II to lay smoke screens, it soon gained a second role, sending loud explosive rockets out to about 2 kilometers. Crowds in West Berlin press against a rough new concrete wall in 1961, trying to spot loved ones on the other side of the divided city. An East German border guard walks a lonely line between worlds on a street that overnight became a frontier. In the 1950s, rows of iron lungs like these kept polio patients breathing by mechanically moving their chests when their own muscles could not. Some children lived inside these metal tubes for years until mass vaccination in the late 1950s. Smoke rises over Tulsa's Greenwood district in 1921 when crowds tore through the area once called Black Wall Street. In less than 2 days, more than 30 blocks and about 1,200 homes were wiped out, with witnesses even reporting small planes dropping fire from above. Families crowd around Edison's phonograph in the 1880s, each person listening through a separate rubber tube like early shared headphones. For 5 cents a tune, this box let ordinary people hear famous bands and voices from miles away. This is David Vetter, the boy who had to live inside a clear plastic room because his body had almost no immune defense. In his 12 years, he never felt another person's direct touch, and his care cost over $1.3 million. These children step out of a barrack at Auschwitz as Soviet soldiers enter the camp on 27 January 1945. Around 7,000 weak prisoners were still alive inside, and over 200 Red Army soldiers lost their lives in the final fight to open the gates. This photo shows the crew of the Andrea Gale before they sailed into the huge North Atlantic storm of October 1991. Their 6-man fishing boat disappeared in waves reported near 100 feet high and has never been found. After the battleship Bismarck went down in 1941, sailors clung to wreckage as HMS Dorsetshire hauled them up the side on ropes. Only about 110 men were rescued from a crew of more than 2,000. In 1961, a Freedom Rider Greyhound bus near Anniston, Alabama was surrounded and set ablaze while activists rode to challenge bus segregation. Every rider on board escaped the smoke, and photos of the burning coach helped push federal action on civil rights. An American soldier relaxes with a South Vietnamese woman during a brief break from fighting. Thousands of whirlwind romances like this ended overnight in 1975 when U.S. forces left, and many local partners were suddenly stranded. Hypnotist W.J. Ausby balances on a rigid human bridge during a stage demonstration in the mid-20th century. This classic hypnosis stunt was meant to prove how a trance could make the body lock so stiff it could support a grown man in a suit. Workers on the CN Tower in Toronto bolt steel in place while standing hundreds of meters above the city in the mid-1970s. When it opened in 1976, the tower reached about 553 meters, the tallest freestanding structure on Earth at the time. In 1948, NBC created its election night graphics by pointing a television camera at a printed Life magazine-style card taped to a wall. That year was one of the first times Americans followed a presidential race live on television. During a military parade in Cairo on 6 October 1981, soldiers riding in trucks suddenly turned and opened fire toward President Anwar Sadat's viewing stand. That brief burst of gunfire ended the rule of the man who had signed Egypt's peace treaty with Israel just 3 years earlier. Brigitte Bardot smiles at the height of her fame in the 1950s when every magazine copied her hair and makeup. Her carefree look helped redefine movie beauty worldwide and turned Saint-Tropez into a glamorous destination. Before snowplows, teams of horses pulled giant wooden snow rollers like this to crush fresh drifts into a hard, smooth roadway. On a good day, one roller could pack miles of country roads so sleighs could slide along almost as fast as summer wagons. In 1947, Thor Heyerdahl crossed about 4,300 miles of Pacific Ocean from Peru to Polynesia on a raft of balsa logs and hemp rope. His Kon-Tiki voyage lasted 101 days and was meant to show that ancient South American sailors might have reached these islands long before modern ships. This worn destroyer is HMS Campbelltown after British commandos drove her straight into the St. Nazaire dry dock in March 1942. Hours later, hidden charges inside the ship went off and wrecked the only dock on the Atlantic coast that could service the German battleship Tirpitz. This 16-page Mickey Mouse book from 1930 was Disney's first try at a story, game, and songbook all in one. In 2024, a surviving first edition like this sold at auction for $7,155. Visitors press their ears to the curved wall of St. Paul's Cathedral's Whispering Gallery in London in 1950, testing its strange acoustics. 30 meters above the floor and reached by 259 steps. A whisper at one side of this ring can be heard clear as day on the opposite side. In 1955, photographer Erno Vadas captured workers streaming along a worn shortcut toward a factory on the foggy edge of Budapest. The curved dirt trail they carved beside the straight sidewalk became a perfect symbol of how daily life quietly reshapes even a planned socialist city. Coach Alexander Gomelsky walks beside his giant center, Vladimir Tkachenko, in 1986, who stood about 2.2 meters tall. Tkachenko's reach was so great that he could dunk without jumping, becoming one of the most feared big men in European basketball. In 1956, IBM's first hard disk, the IBM 350, used 50 spinning disks and weighed over a ton to store only about 3.75 megabytes of data. It was the first drive that could jump straight to any record. In 1967, Muhammad Ali shocked America by refusing to enter the Vietnam conflict, saying his faith would not let him fight overseas. He lost his heavyweight crown and prime boxing years for that stand until the Supreme Court cleared him in 1971. In the first century, engineer Hero of Alexandria built this temple vending machine in Roman Egypt to trade a coin for a measured splash of holy water. The coin tipped a hidden lever to open a valve, making this little shrine gadget the ancestor of every snack and drink machine today. Polish resistance fighters crouched behind rubble in Warsaw in 1944, turning ruined streets into their own fortress. During the Warsaw Uprising, they held out for 63 days with almost no outside support, using everything from captured rifles to homemade weapons. A century after World War I, this calm forest in France still follows the curves of old frontline trenches. So many buried shells and munitions remain under the roots that parts of the region may stay off limits for hundreds of years. This Waverly ad from 1900 shows an early electric car pitched as stylish city transport, long before gas engines took over the roads. At the time, about 40% of American cars ran on steam, and roughly 38% were electric. This compact wooden box is a Civil War surgeon's kit from 1864, holding knives, forceps, bandages, and bottles of chloroform. With tools like these, a single Army doctor might operate on dozens of wounded soldiers in one long day on the battlefield. A hidden valley in the Ardennes holds a traffic jam of rusted cars slowly sinking into the forest floor. According to local stories, American servicemen parked them here at the end of World War II and simply never came back for them. Arnold Schwarzenegger flips through a bodybuilding book with Soviet fans in Moscow in 1988, when Western action stars still felt like visitors from another planet. That year, he was in the USSR promoting films like Red Hei. A U.S. Marine in Korea in May 1951 sends a sheet of fire across a hillside, lighting up the night like a furnace. Flame weapons were used to clear thick brush and dugouts that could block an entire division's advance. Decades after World War II, a farmer's field on the former Eastern Front turned up this steel helmet welded to the tail of a mortar round. Finds like this silent relic show how the soil still slowly returns the gear carried into some of the fiercest battles on Earth. A team of British militiamen poses with the nose of an Italian Fiat CR lowered. Falco, which crash-landed in the south of England during the Battle of Britain. Italy sent this outdated biplane into modern aerial combat at the end of the 40s instead of returning to base. On a freezing January day in 1990, this Soviet policeman stood guard as Moscow's first McDonald's opened its doors. That single restaurant served more than 30,000 curious customers on day one, turning a simple burger line into a symbol of an era ending. An entire wolf pack of 42 German U-boats sits lined up at Lisa Halley in Northern Ireland at the end of World War II, waiting to be disposed of. Most of these submarines were later towed out to sea and deliberately sunk in Operation Deadlight. In 1969, a DC-4 cargo plane broke apart over Miami, dropping this entire engine straight onto a Ford Mustang below. The engine weighed close to a ton, turning the sports car into an instant metal pancake and a famous photo of freak chance. A World War I soldier curls into a mud hole, hands over his head, trying to outlast the noise above the trench. Many men spent more time like this, waiting through endless bombardments, than actually running across the battlefield. In the 1920s, a U.S. Navy stunt team flew biplanes linked by long ropes, so tight that if one banked, the others had to follow. Crowds below watched three tied-together aircraft loop and turn as if they were one giant flying machine. German sailors line up against a visiting Japanese submarine crew for a friendly football match in Europe in 1944. Even in the middle of the Second World War, the Axis partners still found time to trade kicks on a muddy field instead of shots at sea. These early 19th century food cans fed soldiers on faraway Napoleonic battlefields decades before anyone invented a can opener. For about 50 years, hungry people literally attacked dinner with a hammer and chisel just to get the lid off. In 1956, photographer Harry Trask leaned out of a small plane, fighting sickness, to capture the Andrea Doria as it rolled onto its side in the Atlantic. One of his 16 rush shots won a Pulitzer Prize and became the defining image of the doomed Italian liner. At a 1950 air show, a B-29 bomber sliced through the smoke trail of a tiny biplane in a stunt that came seconds from disaster. More than 60,000 spectators watched the two planes miss each other by a heartbeat, and then roar away as if nothing had happened. In the 1970s, this laughing contestant on The Dating Game charmed the audience like any other hopeful bachelor. Years later, people learned he was Rodney Alcala, later convicted of a string of very serious crimes against women. Kids in Newcastle's West End turned a demolition site into their own stunt park in 1981, leaping from balconies onto a pile of old mattresses. In an era before strict safety rules and phone screens, this was how many children chased adrenaline after school. The fishing boat New England sits in a British Columbia harbor in 1916, turned into a frozen sculpture by days of sea spray and Arctic wind. Crews on ships like this sometimes had to hack tons of ice off the decks or risk the extra weight flipping the vessel. In a worn stairwell in Khujand, Tajikistan, a gigantic Lenin head waits silently behind the railing like a forgotten guardian. The statue once faced crowds in a public square, but now only tired neighbors climbing the stairs meet its stone gaze. Yuri Gagarin sits silent on the bus to the launch pad on 12 April 1961, moments before riding Vostok 1 into the unknown. In just 108 minutes, he would circle Earth once and become the first human to travel in space. Sailors play a casual soccer match on a World War II carrier deck as a biplane roars past just meters overhead. For many crews, moments like this were the only break from months of tense patrols on an empty sea. During World War I in German East Africa, British troops actually painted horses with zebra stripes to blend into the bush and confuse enemy scouts. Some officers also hoped the fake zebra pattern might trick tsetse flies, which spread deadly disease to normal horses. In the North African desert, tank crews joked that their armor was so hot they could cook breakfast on it, and this photo proves it with an egg sizzling on the metal. Inside those vehicles, temperatures could climb above 50 degrees Celsius, turning every patrol into a rolling oven. Two Soviet friends pose in uniform as teenagers during the Second World War, medals on their chests and an uncertain future ahead. Over 70 years later, they meet again, holding old photos and laughing like the same girls who once stood side by side on the front line. Kurdish schoolgirls in Iran sit in class in the late 1970s, when lessons and clothing still followed a more relaxed, pre-1979 style. Within a few years, strict new rules and tighter controls on Kurdish culture would change schools like this beyond recognition. Passengers at Pan Am's Miami terminal study a giant globe to trace their flying boat routes across the oceans. In the 1940s, this Art Deco hall was the main American gateway to Latin America and the Caribbean, long before jet airliners and online booking. Activists from the women's liberation movement hand-paint signs demanding control over their own bodies in the late 1960s. Their protests for reproductive rights helped spark legal and social changes that still shape debates today. On Halloween 1926, escape artist Harry Houdini died days after a student suddenly punched his stomach, apparently rupturing his appendix. He ignored the pain, kept performing, and the daredevil trick that built his legend ended up writing his final act. In 1970, officials in Florence, Oregon tried to clear a 45-foot beached whale by packing it with dynamite, expecting the sea and seagulls to finish the job. Instead, the blast hurled greasy whale chunks onto cars and rooftops hundreds of feet away, while most of the carcass still lay on the beach. She lives across the street from a massive power station, but 1972 energy shortages left her eating dinner by candlelight. During Britain's rolling blackouts, even neighbors of the turbines sat in the dark while the cooling towers glowed outside their windows. Buckminster Fuller's 1930s Dymaxion car was a three-wheeled teardrop bus that could carry 11 people and pivot almost in its own length. Its radical design wowed crowds, but a prototype accident and stability fears kept it from reshaping city streets. Families fleeing the Dust Bowl packed everything they owned onto rattling cars and headed for California in hopes of work. This rolling mountain of furniture and kids near Bakersfield in 1939 shows just how desperate and determined that journey could be. Children in heavy coats line up at a factory door, heading in for a 12-hour night shift in the United States in 1908. For many of them, childhood meant long hours of exhausting work instead of school or sleep. An RAF navigator plots a night mission inside a short Stirling bomber, using paper charts and a mechanical flight computer instead of GPS. Every course change and survival chance for the crew depended on calculations like these. Traders on Wall Street watch in disbelief as Black Monday unfolds on October 19, 1987. In a single day, a record stock market crash wipes out an estimated $1.7 trillion in value worldwide. In 1930s New York, socialite mannequin Cynthia went to dinners, smoked, and attended parties like any real celebrity. When she accidentally fell and shattered in 1942, newspapers ran mock obituaries and tributes as if a beloved star had just been lost. In 1914, Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa posed smiling with U.S. General John J. Pershing, then still treated as a friendly partner. Just 2 years later, Pershing would lead the Pancho Villa expedition, sending U.S. troops into Mexico to chase the very man he once stood beside. Soviet road crews in World War II threw together simple wooden decks over streams and ravines so supply trucks never stopped. Many of these shaky-looking crossings were built under constant danger because every new path meant more fuel and food reaching the front. After U.S. agents seized Al Capone's heavily armored limo, it didn't go to a junkyard. It went to the government garage. After the events at Pearl Harbor, Secret Service agents rolled out the former gangster car to shield President Franklin D. Roosevelt on the streets of Washington. On October 1, 1903, overflow crowds at Boston's Huntington Avenue grounds watched the very first World Series game with fans packed right onto the outfield grass. The Pittsburgh Pirates beat the Boston Americans 7-3 as Jimmy Sebring hit the first series home run and legend Cy Young took the loss. Red Army sappers crawl through deep snow to cut a gap in German barbed wire near Zhytomyr, Ukraine, December 1943. Every cleared strand opened a path for the winter offensive, driving the Eastern Front back to the west. Civil defense workers and a nurse picked their way through rubble after an air raid during the Blitz in London, 1941. Volunteer rescue teams like these helped keep the city functioning despite months of nightly attacks from the sky. Police examined the rural bridge in Buckinghamshire, where the gang stopped the Royal Mail train during the Great Train Robbery on August 8, 1963. The thieves tampered with the signals, boarded the night mail, and escaped with $2.6 million, one of the biggest cash hauls in British history. West Indian and Australian troops worked side by side in 1917, stacking heavy 8-inch shells at a supply dump near the Battle of Ypres. Their unseen labor kept the guns firing for one of the First World War's longest and muddiest campaigns. During World War II, U.S. posters urged citizens to see Soviet and Chinese soldiers as friends fighting for the same cause. Within just a few years, those smiling allies would become rivals in a new era of global tension. A British soldier orders a German woman back into a mandatory newsreel screening after she reportedly laughed at footage of liberated camps. The Allies made local civilians watch these films so they could no longer deny what had been done in their country's name. Each little flag on this map marks a Japanese ship now lying on the ocean floor after World War II. By 1945, relentless attacks had erased most of Japan's navy and merchant fleet, starving its island empire of fuel, food, and reinforcements. An 1870 operating room where surgeons worked barehanded in street clothes with only a few simple instruments on the table. They're experimenting with carbolic acid as an early antiseptic, not yet realizing how harsh and dangerous the chemical really is. On 25 February 1890, Britain recorded its first deadly automobile accident when this early motor carriage left the road and its 2 occupants did not survive. Curious onlookers crowd around the surprisingly intact machine, already realizing that the new age of travel came with unexpected risks. This is Commission Exhibit 399, the famous magic bullet from the 1963 Dallas shooting involving President John F. Kennedy and Governor John Connally. Its unusual condition and trajectory sparked decades of debate, investigations, and conspiracy theories. In 1916, during the World War I, workers in this workshop carved and assembled rows of wooden prosthetic legs for soldiers returning from the front. Factories like this became grim evidence of industrial-scale warfare, where mass production was needed not only for weapons, but for new bodies. In 1952, New York tabloids splashed the headline, "Ex-GI becomes blonde beauty," after former soldier Christine Jorgensen returned from Europe having undergone pioneering gender-affirming surgeries. Overnight, she became one of the first widely known transgender women in the U.S. Crowds packed London's Trafalgar Square in 1969, watching the Apollo 11 moon landing on a giant outdoor screen as night falls over the city. For many of them, this was the first time they saw live pictures beamed from another world. In 1923, a New Jersey church service allowed hooded extremists to sit openly in the pews and stand beside the pastor at the pulpit. The chilling scene shows how a violent hate movement once tried to cloak itself in respectability and religion. This ragged boy, photographed in London's East End, was one of the street children who convinced Dr. Thomas Barnardo that no child should be turned away. His worn face helped inspire a network of orphanages and ragged schools that would shelter and educate thousands of destitute children across Britain. Rocky Dennis, born in 1961, lived with an extremely rare bone condition that reshaped his skull and face. Doctors once said he wouldn't live past 7, but he reached 16 and inspired the 1985 film Mask about his remarkable life. In the late 1920s, Canadian medium Elizabeth Poole wowed seance guests by making a heavy table levitate in Dr. Hamilton's Winnipeg parlor. Investigators later suggested hidden supports and clever choreography, but for those in the room, it felt like gravity itself had snapped. In 1926, Benito Mussolini appeared with his nose bandaged after Irishwoman Violet Gibson's failed attempt on his life in Rome. She was quickly declared insane and deported, while the regime used his small wound as a tool for grand propaganda. In late 1945, Japanese left-wing activists marched through Tokyo for the first time after strict wartime crackdowns were lifted. Under Allied occupation, protests like this signaled a sudden return of free speech and political parties to Japan's streets. A soldier of the Czechoslovak Legion stands by a rail car, marked with the slogan, "Better to die free than live in chains," during the Russian Civil War in 1918. Their trains became moving strongholds as these former prisoners of war fought across Siberia, chasing the dream of an independent Czechoslovak homeland. This rough postcard was sent to Charles Lindbergh in March 1932, claiming the baby was safe and that more steps would follow. A chain of notes like this one passed through secret meetings and cash drops, later helped investigators track down the man accused in the Lindbergh case. In 1877, John D. Lee sits on his own coffin at Mountain Meadows, Utah, moments before his sentence was carried out for the Mountain Meadows tragedy. He became the only person officially held to account for the 1857 attack on a passing wagon train. This family dives to the grass in Dealey Plaza as President John Kennedy's car passes behind them in Dallas in November 1963, seconds after the first terrifying sounds echoed through the plaza. Bill and Gail Newman later said they believed the danger came from behind them on the grassy knoll. The broken shell of a bank stands after the Great Chicago Fire of October 1871, when flames swept through the city and turned whole streets into ash. A famous story blames a cow kicking over a lantern in a barn. Japanese soldiers stand in line at a so-called comfort station in occupied China in the late 1930s. These stations were part of a wide military-run network across Asia that later became one of the most debated and scandalous chapters of the war. This is Johnstown, Pennsylvania, after the South Fork Dam burst on May 31, 1889, sending a wall of water that matched the flow of the Mississippi River and wiped out most of the town in minutes. In 1926, Ezilphia Mary Watt Flynn sits for this portrait at the age of 101, after a life that stretched from the early 1800s into the age of cars and radios. As the partner of Underground Railroad guide Richard Red Fox Flynn, she helped people travel in secret toward freedom. 2 British officers posed by the plain van tied to Operation Mincemeat, a secret World War II plan that used one deceased man and forged papers to mislead the enemy. The false invasion orders he carried pushed German leaders to shift forces away from Sicily. This photo shows the battle off Samar in 1944, when a small group of American escort carriers and destroyers charged so hard that Japanese observers thought every ship was a much larger class. Their smoke, torpedoes, and non-stop attacks were enough to make a force led by the giant battleship Yamato turn away from the invasion beaches. This is the inner courtyard of Newgate Prison in London in 1895, a narrow stone canyon hemmed in by walls and barred windows. For centuries, people paced this yard under guard before the prison finally closed in 1902, leaving its stories locked in brick. Julius Duke sits in a Chicago police station in 1906 after being detained for wearing this blouse, skirt, and wig. At the time, many American cities treated clothing rules as a legal matter, so photos like this one reveal how far ideas about gender expression. In 1948, a young Donald Sutherland stands second from the left in his school puppet club in St. John, New Brunswick, Canada. The boy learning to pull strings here would later command movie screens in films from MASH to The Hunger Games. In 1982, Larry Walters, later called Lawn Chair Larry, floated above California in a simple lawn chair lifted by 45 weather balloons and accidentally climbed into airline sky lanes. He landed safely after hours in the air, paid a fine for breaking flight rules. On the morning of April 14, 1912, the captain of Titanic canceled a planned lifeboat drill, even though safety drills were standard on large passenger ships. That quiet decision, made just hours before the ship hit the iceberg and went down, left crew and passengers unprepared. Police carry a young John Lewis away during a 1961 civil rights protest in Tennessee, one of many times he was detained for quietly refusing to accept segregation. Decades later, after a lifetime of nonviolent struggle, he watched the first black president take the oath of office. In 1945, a woman stands with her belongings beside a canal while the shattered buildings of Berlin rise behind her. Within a few years, people like her would help turn this broken city into one of the main crossroads of post-war Europe. These are real portraits of boys who served in the American Civil War between 1861 and 1865, some only 12 or 13 years old. Many lied about their age to join as musicians, messengers, or even frontline soldiers, so a school-age generation ended up on the front lines of a divided nation. Banker J.P. Morgan Jr. smiles with circus performer Lia Graff on his knee, a press photo that briefly turned her into a worldwide sensation. Years later, she returned to Germany, where the regime's harsh race laws sent her into the camp system, and she is believed never to have come back. In 1957, mountaineer Kurt Diemberger looked back on Chogolisa and captured these two lonely tracks on the snow ridge, one line curving safely home, and the other ending at the edge. His partner, Herman Boole, had just stepped off the main trail onto a fragile snow cornice and vanished into the clouds. Behind this butterfly mask is Juana Barraza, a Mexico City lucha libre wrestler who once entertained crowds under the name the Lady of Silence. Years later, she was arrested and convicted in a shocking case involving a series of attacks on elderly women. In September 1939, 10-year-old Kazimiera Mika kneels in a Warsaw field beside her sister just after a low-flying raid by German planes. Kazimiera lived into the 21st century and later said she never forgave the air crews for that day, even as this image became one of the war's most haunting pictures. Around 1938, the Wadlow family has dinner, while a special platform table lets 19-year-old Robert, the tallest recorded man in history, sit almost eye to eye with his parents. By then, he measured 8 feet 11 inches. In 1952, far-right demonstrators gather outside a German Social Democratic official's home, while a message on the wall brands him a traitor for helping catch a fugitive from the old regime. Local politicians from other parties then shunned him. A soldier of the 8th Pennsylvania Reserves poses with the battle-torn flag his regiment carried through some of the hardest marches of the American Civil War. Color bearers like him had to stand in the open as a living marker for the line, and very few of them finished the war without wounds. In 1963, a French stray cat named Félicette was placed in this small capsule and sent into space on a Veronique rocket as part of a science experiment. She returned alive after a short flight, and to this day she is the only cat in history known to travel to space and come back. This photo shows a Hiroshima streetcar reduced to a bare metal shell after the 1945 city blast, and the same car later rebuilt. Car 1908 still carries passengers today, turning a wreck from the ruins into a moving memorial of survival. In 1958, a massive wave in Lituya Bay, Alaska, shot up the mountainside to about 1,720 feet, taller than most city towers. The wave was triggered when a huge rockfall crashed into the bay, scraping trees off the slopes like matchsticks. In 1933, Vernon Presley and Gladys Love Smith ran off to marry in Mississippi, even lying about their ages on the license. 2 years later, they had twin boys, and the surviving child, Elvis Presley, grew up to become one of the best-selling music stars in history. In 1943, the Nicholas brothers performed their wild jump-and-jive routine in the film Stormy Weather, flying over each other into splits down a staircase. Fred Astaire later called it the greatest dance number ever put on film. The phrase, "mad as a hatter," comes from old hat makers in the 18th and 19th centuries who worked with mercury-treated felt. Years of breathing in the fumes damaged their nerves, giving many workers shaking hands and strange mood changes that people linked with the trade. In the early 1940s, Swiss engineer Georges de Mestral came home from a walk and studied the burrs stuck to his clothes and his dog under a microscope, seeing tiny hooks gripping tiny loops. That simple idea became Velcro, which he patented in 1955 and later used everywhere from kids' shoes to spacesuits. In the 1920s, a long-told story says Charlie Chaplin secretly entered a look-alike contest and only placed around the middle of the pack. His hat, mustache, and cane were copied so well by fans that the judges thought the imitations looked more like Chaplin than Chaplin himself. In the late 1980s, cartel boss Pablo Escobar was so rich that he offered to pay Colombia's entire $10 billion national debt if the country promised never to send him to the United States. The offer was refused, and his battle against extradition helped change Colombia's laws. In 1928, adventurer Richard Halliburton swam the entire length of the Panama Canal and was charged only 38 cents for the toll. It remains the lowest canal transit fee ever recorded, and he paid it as self-propelled cargo. On 7 September 1921, a young civil servant named Frank Duff founded the Legion of Mary in Dublin with just a handful of volunteers and a simple plan for laypeople to serve the poor and visit the lonely. That tiny local group grew into the largest lay organization in the Catholic Church. At 29, Adrian Brody became the youngest man to win the Oscar for Best Leading Actor for his role in The Pianist. To feel like a man stripped of everything, he sold his car, moved out, ended his relationship, lost about 15 kilograms, and learned Chopin pieces, so the piano playing on screen is really him. In 1961, Cuban leader Fidel Castro leans in to talk with Yuri Gagarin, the first human to travel into space during the cosmonauts' celebrated visit to Havana. For many people across the world, this meeting of a young space hero and a rising political icon looked like history shaking hands with the future. In 1993, during the tense political crisis in Moscow, a young Russian soldier leans from his armored vehicle to kiss his girlfriend beside the street. The moment froze a strange mix of new Russia's unrest and very ordinary love happening right next to a machine built for war. In 1968, former First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy stepped out of a Greek chapel on the island of Scorpios with shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis, now her new husband. The sudden wedding joined American political royalty with one of the richest and most private businessmen on the planet. In 1950, a clown in full costume worked as a street barker on Broadway in San Francisco's North Beach, ringing his bells to pull people into a burlesque nightclub. The clash of circus smiles and late-night neon made this one of the strangest jobs in post-war show business. In 1970, a girl later called Jeannie was discovered in Los Angeles after spending almost her whole childhood shut away with almost no spoken language around her. Scientists and teachers tried to help her learn to talk, and her struggle became a famous case showing that if the early years are lost, the brain may never fully develop normal language. In late 1929, the Lawson family lined up in their best clothes for this holiday portrait, never knowing it would become a symbol of a coming tragedy. Days later, most faces in this photo were gone after a shocking family event that still has no clear explanation. In the late 1960s at Cornell University, Black student activists marched out of an occupied campus building after a 36-hour protest, still wearing bandoliers and carrying rifles. In 1935, the United States Army flew over the Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii and dropped explosive charges on a lava flow, hoping to steer it away from homes. The lava slowed later, but scientists still argue whether the blasts helped or the volcano simply changed course on its own. In 1914, many of Germany's merchant ships were still insured in London by Lloyd's, with policies that even covered damage from war. When Britain and Germany entered World War I, British insurers suddenly faced huge payouts on vessels sailing under the flag of their new enemy. British General Bernard Montgomery rides in his command tank in the North African desert during World War II, binoculars in hand as he studies the front. Known for stern discipline and dry humor, he once warned his troops to take proper care of their health when seeking horizontal refreshments while on leave. In 1918, during the Battle of St. Mihiel, American medics wrapped captured German soldiers in blankets and bandaged their wounds under a Red Cross flag. Photos like this were used to show that even in the chaos of World War I, the new American Army tried to follow rules of mercy toward its prisoners. Around 1944, this Royal Australian Air Force short Sunderland flying boat floated at anchor in Rose Bay, Sydney Harbor, its crew working from a mooring compartment hidden in the bulbous nose. That front porch of the aircraft held anchors, winches, boat hooks, and ladders. In the mid-1940s, Willie's Jeeps roll in a perfect line toward the open belly of a Curtiss C-46 transport, driving straight into the aircraft like a moving garage. Planes like this could lift whole mini convoys at once, turning distant airstrips into instant motor pools the moment they landed. In 1919, Medal of Honor recipient Alvin York poses in uniform with his mother outside their simple home in Pall Mall, Tennessee, his chest lined with new ribbons. Just a year earlier, this quiet farmer had led a tiny patrol in the Meuse Argonne and captured more than 132 enemy soldiers. On July 14, 1966, a young paratrooper of the 173rd Airborne Brigade stands in the Vietnam jungle, his face smeared with mud after a long morning on the line. The weary stare caught in this photo became one of the classic images of how the war aged even its youngest soldiers. An aging veteran of the 9th Texas Infantry holds the battle flag his unit carried at Shiloh, Perryville, Stones River, and Chickamauga during the early 1860s. So patched and faded, it looks like a map of every march in camp. The flag is a rare survivor of the Atlanta campaign and other hard marches. In the late 1950s, Houston kids knew Bunny Orsak as Keterick, the cat-eared host of Channel 13's popular children's show. Here she pauses mid-pose during a live commercial for Bosco when local TV stars sold chocolate drink mix right on the studio floor. Around 1881, the Alamo in San Antonio flies its flag at half-mast, likely mourning the death of President James Garfield. At this time, the old mission was partly used as a busy commercial complex called the Alamo Building, decades before it was restored as a historic shrine. In 1935, a young girl sits in a bare room after her family was moved from Taos Junction to the new Bosque Farms resettlement in New Mexico. The project was part of a New Deal plan that picked whole farm families up from dust-ruined land and gave them small irrigated plots to start over. In 1922, children stood outside the White House with signs like this boy's, telling the president it had been 4 years since he saw his father. They were part of a small but powerful protest asking for men still held from the war years to be allowed to come home. In 1963, women in Togo crowd together in the streets to mourn President Sylvanus Olympio after a sudden military takeover ended his rule. He had led the country from independence in 1960, so his fall became the young nation's first painful clash between bright new hopes and hard power struggles. In 1942, third-generation American children of Japanese ancestry cling to their parents in small suitcases in Byron, California, waiting for buses to government assembly centers. Most of these families were United States citizens. In 1940, two children peer through the broken boards of their family's shack in a labor camp near Weed Patch, California, where rent cost $2.75 plus electricity. Camps like this held Dust Bowl families who had driven west chasing farm work. Around 1906, men line up at midnight outside the Bowery Mission in New York City, waiting quietly for free bread and coffee. Photos of scenes like this helped push city leaders and reformers to confront how deep urban poverty had grown in the new century. In 1963, Sicilian teenager Franca Viola was kidnapped by a rejected suitor who expected to restore his honor by forcing a so-called rehabilitating marriage. She and her father refused, took him to court instead, and her landmark stand helped Italy scrap the law in 1981. After losing both arms and his sight in World War I, Normandy soldier Georges Roy returned to France as one of the so-called broken faces. In 1917, Marguerite Lavenu, a young woman from his village who had barely known him before, chose to marry him in Paris. In 1869, this Harvard College bill shows a full term of classes, library, room, fuel, and board costing just $170.42. By comparison, a year at Harvard in the 2020s can reach over $80,000, turning this old receipt into a tiny time capsule of how college costs exploded. In the 1880s, New Englanders watched a silent wanderer they called the Leatherman tramp by, in a suit of hand sewn leather from head to toe. He walked a 365-mile loop through Connecticut and New York every 34 days for years. In 1929, this Jewish woman from the little-known B'nai Korath tribe in the Arabian Peninsula was photographed in her traditional dress and face veil. Images like this are rare because most Jewish communities in this region slowly faded or moved away during the following decades. Rube Waddell was an early 1900s baseball pitcher who might stop mid-game to chase a fire engine or run over to play with a puppy in the stands. Behind the clownish habits was a master on the mound who won the pitching Triple Crown in 1905. In February 1947, this tiny outpost at Snag in Yukon logged minus 83 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest temperature ever recorded in North America. It was so still and bitter that voices carried for miles, and people said their breath fell to the ground as a little cloud of ice. This old typed sheet is a life map, where one man carefully tracked every move, job, and paycheck from the early 1900s onward. At the far right, he even logged how many girls he dated in each town, turning his work history into a quirky early spreadsheet of love and money. In 1957, children crowd around an Easter bunny in a homemade costume whose wide glass eyes look more like a surreal mask than a storybook rabbit. Early holiday outfits were often hand-stitched from whatever fabric people had, which is why so many mid-century bunnies look a bit more eerie than cheerful in old photos. In 1968, this New York restaurant tried a stunt where a young waitress served as a human menu with the prices written directly on her outfit. The gimmick was sold as playful advertising at the time, but today it looks like a sharp snapshot of how different attitudes toward women. Around 1900, a teacher runs a math drill while the blackboard also reminds students that the world is round and a noun is a name, a tiny snapshot of what school once looked like. On the right, a boy sits apart in a pointed dunce cap, a real classroom habit back then when public embarrassment was considered a normal way to correct behavior. In the early 1970s, producer Albert S. Ruddy leans in to talk through a scene with Marlon Brando while filming The Godfather on a real street in Manhattan's Little Italy. Brando's quiet, detailed work in moments like this helped turn his role as Vito Corleone into one of the most studied performances in movie history. In 1895, a hairdresser proudly displays ornaments of human hair, shaping other people's hair into dramatic curls and horns for evening fashion. Hair jewelry and hair pieces like these were once prized keepsakes, worn as stylish trophies or mourning tokens, long before they started to look unsettling to modern eyes. In 1948, a young fan stands by Babe Ruth's open casket, clutching a baseball as he wipes away tears during the farewell service. More than 100,000 people came to say goodbye, and many children carried balls like this, as if the legend might sign them one last time. In 1922, this woman in London stands inside one of the first electric tanning machines, a ring of powerful lamps meant to copy the brightest seaside sun. Advertised as a health and beauty wonder, it could give a bronze glow in minutes, but also a painful sunburn if you stayed inside too long. A British soldier sits at the entrance of his muddy trench on the Western Front, carefully eating from a tin while war rumbles just out of frame. Moments like this quiet meal were rare breaks in a life of cold, noise, and waiting between orders. In November 1938, fur workers in New York marched through the streets with signs urging a boycott of German goods after news of attacks on Jewish shops and synagogues in Europe. Long before the full scale of the war was known, small unions like this tried to warn the world about where rising hate was heading. After his death in 1948, Gandhi's few daily belongings could fit on a single table: 2 pairs of sandals, a walking stick, simple bowls, and a pair of round glasses. For a man who moved millions and shook an empire, this tiny collection is a quiet proof of how little he kept for himself. In 1964, high school student Randy Gardner stayed awake for 264 hours to help scientists study what extreme lack of sleep does to the mind. The objects on his bed were part of memory tests he had to pass again and again to prove he was still thinking clearly. In 1870, 70-year-old Louisa Ann Swain calmly walked to a polling place in Laramie, Wyoming, and dropped a folded ballot into the box, becoming the first woman in the United States to vote in a general election. Her quiet act in a frontier town came 50 years before the 19th Amendment. From a distance, Stonehenge looks almost tiny, sitting alone in a flat English field while cars rush past on the A303. Thousands of drivers see this 5,000-year-old stone circle in their peripheral vision every day, like a casual roadside monument from another world. In the early 20th century, peanut sellers sometimes dressed in full suits, covered with real peanuts to pull crowds at fairs and parades. The outfit turned their whole body into moving advertisement so people could spot the snack stand long before they smelled the roasted nuts.